this is just me jumping onto the talk, the first opinion piece that we put together for the special issue. And this was sort of based around the review. This I've talked about this a few times already, and this review was long time in the making. And it cited applications of virtual reality, or VR in short, in autism research and current trends and taxonomy of definitions. And so I'll run through the sort of just general history of how we got to this review, why it's important, and everything else is go through. I think generally, I don't know, I think we need to define virtual reality and autism, hopefully at this stage. More sort of broader definitions are available on the first page of our website. You can have a look. Autism is generally characterized by a neurodevelopmental condition that is often described as individuals having some issues with social aspects of day-to-day repetitive behaviors and some sensory sensitivities. And virtual reality is it has as many definitions as I'm sure you can imagine. It can be described as an experience of presence as you are entering virtual environment or virtual world, or can be defined by the hardware itself. And in this scenario, we have a head-mounted display or these sort of three-dimensional glasses. So this is where the biggest problem was, as I was starting my PhD, and I'm sure everyone who has done some work in this area has started to realize that it's what virtual reality is, or how it's defined in literature, is a little bit confusing. So in the first few iterations of this review, we tried to put together some sort of definitions around the degrees of freedom, or what is immersion, how it's related to the technology, but that has changed since then. So before we move any forward with this discussion, I want to make sure we all understand what we mean by degrees of freedom, or some other definitions that might come up as we progress with the conference or just this talk. So 3 degrees of freedom, what we normally refer to is just an ability to look around the three-dimensional world. So it's usually the head-mounted displays. You might have seen those. They are sometimes referred to standalone virtual reality headsets. They usually utilize either a mobile phone, or they're quite simplified in some way or another. You cannot interact with the virtual environment. You can just look around the 360-degree videos, where the 6 degrees of freedom is what you would, I suppose, particularly recently associate with fully immersive virtual reality, where you are surrounded by 360-degree video, but you also are able to interact with the environment. And so, like I said, this review has been done several times. It's started off from the very start of my PhD, and now I'm in my final year. And we kept getting more and more authors added on as the years progressed. So the initial review was 2015 to 2019. Virtual reality was, of course, around way before 2015, but we selected that date mostly because ever since Oculus was acquired by Facebook at the time, now Meta, there was a huge increase in the research on virtual reality, mostly because the headsets have become cheaper, more accessible, and a lot better. So initial review was conducted just for those few years. Then the second one, we had to add another year from 2015 to 2020. And then finally, the most recent iteration, which has been turned into opinion piece, has been 2015 to 2021. Particularly the last 2 iterations of this review were really important to note that over the past sort of 2-3 years, the literature has exponentially grown. We use the same databases, just very broad ones, Google Scholar, PubMed, and Web of Science, and this, the broad keywords such as virtual reality and autism. But it just was very evident that the journal articles have increased nearly double over the past few years. So it's just very evident that the research in this particular area is really taking off. So these are just, I'm going to go through some general observations, although we performed a more thorough reviews the first few times. The opinion piece that's coming out as part of this special issue talks just about the general observations and trends in the literature, and then talks about the definitions later on, which I'll get through as part of this presentations. So majority of the papers are focusing on training and intervention of some kind, mostly on social training scenarios, and I think we're going to have a few talks about this as the conference goes on. Mostly small participant numbers, and in some cases just case studies, so just one participant and in-depth analysis. Most of the smaller numbers are earlier in so from 2015 up until about 2019. However, the more recent studies seems to grow in participant numbers. Also, I say here that we've got a peak in numbers in 2016, so straight after the Oculus acquisition by Facebook or Meta now, and then a steep incline of papers arising from 2020. For this particular overview of literature, we focus mostly on journal articles, so peer-reviewed journal articles, not so much on the conference proceedings. They tend to be mostly focused on computer science. That's not to say that those research is not any good. It's just slightly different types of research, and I think it probably warrants a different separate review to try to look at a more technology-focused conferences and see what type of trends we get there. But even looking at the journal articles, you can see there's a slight shift from just purely autism or psychology focus to more technology and human-computer interaction journals over the past few years. So it seems to be becoming more of an interdisciplinary area rather than just specifically focusing on some psychology research. Early on, particularly in the first iteration of this review, the desktop VR, which we mean anything presented on the two-dimensional screen, was still referred to as immersive virtual reality in many papers, and the technology described was not perhaps as detailed as you would expect from papers involving virtual reality. So, but that's been slightly overtaken by head-mounted displays and fully immersive virtual reality over the past few years. And once again, probably just due to increase of accessibility, new generation headsets becoming more cheaper, better, and more accessible to all. Apologies for some pixelated images just now, but this is just to visually illustrate some things that I mentioned, the sort of steep increase in literature over the past few years. The research mostly in North America and Europe. However, recently there's more and more research coming out from East Asian countries as well, mostly in Japan, Korea, and some other countries in Asia. And then again, this particular figure illustrates the literature review from 2015 to 2020, where you can see that head-mounted displays and more immersive virtual reality starting to take over from the two-dimensional displays, and that has been completely taken over or more or less equaled over the past year or so. Some other observations is that the mean age of participants is around 18 to 19. Again, over the past few months, I'm sure there's even more literature that came out And there's quite a lot of research being conducted on younger populations. And throughout our conference, we also noticed that quite a few talks will be on work with children and young adults, which is something perhaps just a trend that we've noticed, but it will be interesting to see what our speakers have to add and why it's important. And again, included one of the examples from earlier work on work conducted on 8 to 10-year-old kids. And again, it illustrates that it was quite a small sample size, probably mostly looking at the feasibility work. Also, as we are looking into autism research, most of the studies still which involve both genders still seem to be about 70 to 80% male, so perhaps slightly does not represent both genders equally as you would want to expect. So this is one of the word clouds, again, just to visually illustrate things that I've just mentioned. So quite a lot of work focuses on children and younger population, quite a bit on social training and interventions, communication, skills training, quite a bit of use of words such as disorder and treatment, which is something we probably would want to avoid. Again, as I mentioned at the start of the conference, we do want to move away from the ableist language. So, but remember, this work includes work conducted from all the way from 2015 onwards. So the language has significantly changed since then. So overall, if we had to group the different trends emerging in literature, you could say that there's a huge portion of literature that focuses on social training and intervention. Despite of the call for broader research topics, and one of the examples discussing this is Cusack and Sterry paper from 2016. Then there's also another group of research that focuses on vocational training, mostly with children and adolescents. And examples of this would be travel training, and there's two papers that we talk about in our special issue opinion piece. And then finally, I suppose it's not the best way to group this research into miscellaneous, but it does seem to be a lot of variable topics that we seem to have just for the time being grouped into this, mostly because you could, I suppose, expect that some of this research would end up being a trend of its own over the next few years. But for the time being, it's just several papers and several groups looking into the work, such as integrating additional technology like biomarkers or eye tracking, or including things like avatars. So it's clearly a lot of interesting and important work taking place. However, it doesn't seem to have a very clear trend in the literature, like social training or vocational training in younger population. Again, this is just to emphasize a few key terminology that seems to have, ever since then, become a little bit more clearer, perhaps, in literature, but still debated. Things like immersion, interaction, and presence are very much linked with each other. So the immersion, you can say, it's the degree to which the technology isolates the user from the reality, which means that user can engage with objects in the virtual environment in real time. And hardware capabilities are inextricably tied to immersion. And then via interaction, you get the presence. So immersion and interaction result in the sense of being present in the virtual environment. It can lead to the psychological sensation of being there in virtual environment, despite the fact that you are actually present in the real world. So these are still very important terms, and this is where some of the debate of what we mean by virtual reality stems from. There is inevitably part of it involves human psychology as to how you experience the virtual world. However, it's also just as important to define the hardware and the technology you're using, just for the sake of any future researchers who want to replicate the work that you do. So this is where and again, I'm just painting this picture quite broadly. You can read about this in greater detail once our special issue comes out. So we end up having several versions of definitions. And in here, in our opinion piece, we talk about VR micro definitions within the broader spectrum of extended reality, which you can refer to as sort of macro definitions. And we consulted a broader literature. So this topic and the issue of how we define virtual reality and what virtual reality actually is seems to extend beyond just autism research. And it's you can find that in immersive education, urban design, dentistry research, and many other types of research. And this debate still continues. And although we emphasize mostly on the technology-centered approach, that's not definitive, and that's not the only way to define virtual reality. So if I've showed this figure before, so it's very simplistic at the time, but ever since then, we put together this sort of a bit more complex, and I tried to break it down a little bit. So now extended reality spectrum, or just extended reality in general, has been used quite a lot in the popular culture. And it, in here we refer to it as how it refers to the real world. So where you have some sort of technology that you can still see the real world, and in this case you can such things like augmented reality, for example, social media filters, is on one end of the spectrum, where another end of the spectrum is virtual reality, where you cannot see any of the real world and you're fully immersed in the virtual environment. And then of course we got something in between with Magic Leap and HoloLens, mixed reality, which perhaps is not used as much anymore, but it at least in research, but it's just as exciting as the other two ends of the spectrum. But if you then take virtual reality on its own and for a minute forget the augmented reality, mixed reality, and all the other types of extended reality, if we focus only on virtual reality, you will have the very, for the lack of a better term, we termed it basic virtual reality. So anything that's monitor-based, the so-called desktop VR, including any type of 3D displays or videos on the monitor itself, where you can still very much be in the real environment, but the immersion then becomes not so much techno-centered, but it's more psychological as to how much attention you're paying into the displays on the monitor. But then we look into the more advanced virtual reality spectrum, and that's when you realize how many different types of virtual reality you actually have. And you can sort of try to break it down into partially and fully immersive. So on the partial immersion, you can have projections, wall projectors, or things like 3 degrees of freedom virtual reality, where I mentioned the standalone or mobile-based virtual reality, like Google Cardboard or mobile phone assisted ones. And then you have vehicle simulations, driving, flying simulators that you still are aware of some of the real world. And then there's quite a bit of KVR, which is the room with projections on the walls. And then it's still somewhat immersive. You're aware of the world, the real world, but it's slowly taking you into the full immersion. And the fully immersive virtual reality, would like to think it's the 6 degrees of freedom head-mounted displays, so technologies such as Oculus, HTC Vive, Pico, and some other new head-mounted displays that are coming out in the past few years. So although it's quite a complex graph, it's important to acknowledge all the different types of technology and be very precise as to how we're defining them. If not for clarity, it's for reproducibility of any future work. So just some concluding remarks. So each subsequent generation of new VR devices improve the usability of the equipment and as well as the user interface interaction and resolution. And with the academics joining social media, conferences becoming online, and the information transfer becoming faster, the terminology is inevitably going to change, and there's going to be different iterations of this, and it's by no means a conclusive types of terminology that we propose here. But for the time being, we want to focus on technology-centered terminology just to make sure we are all on the same page, and then take it from there in the future.